All right, thanks everybody. Like Seth said, Ian McCarty, VP of Operations at eContext, and today we're going to be talking about automated classification of demonstrated interests. This is especially for our market research friends who maybe want to take a very large network, a panel, and be able to mine it for things that are really unique and individual about the people participating in that group. So who is eContext? Well, we are a text classification engine. And that means that we can take unstructured content and make it structured. So that could be user-generated content or digital behavior you might find on the web. So a lot of things we do for our companies is that we help them with their digital behavior classification, clickstream or search query analysis, social media analysis, even audio and video analysis. And a deep classification, especially into a taxonomy, which is what we believe gives you the best marriage of specificity and high-level reporting and analytics, can produce better audience insights, media planning, buying, content recommendation, even targeting advertising. So the question we ask is, how insightful are your consumer insights? And particularly, how close do they correspond to some of these ideal qualities that we like to guide our clients to, which is a deep understanding of the authentic interests, affinities, values of the consumers that you're working with. And this idea of authenticity is something we're going to come back to. And we want to have granular, really specific segmentation of these interests. So we can do targeting, so we can do personalization, but we also want something that can be rolled up, that can be high level. So we can look at large scale trends, so we can have a big picture analysis that we want to put in front of our CMO or our CEO. And the system that we can do that, to have that ability to drill down deeply for specificity, but also roll up for reach, is through a taxonomy. And that's what we've curated. And the ways that we're getting data oftentimes as market researchers is either actively or passively, and each one's going to have, obviously, benefits and drawbacks. Active data collection, which if you guys were in the earlier panels, we heard a lot about, could be surveys or interviews. These could be one-on-one conversations, but they also might be digital. And they're great at doing some things, like producing really specific and granular answers. You can make a very pointed question, you can restrict the answers that the consumer can give back to you, and you can know that it's going to answer the question that you're seeking or the information you're seeking for your brand very pointedly. And you can create a lot of standardization, and we heard this several times this morning already. More standardization is great, because then we can do more quantitative analysis on it. We can do these kind of aggregations across a large sample. We can make sure that the data that's coming back every time is going to agree with itself and be able to be utilized in as many places as we can. But the weakness is that it could be very slow. Could be difficult to scale, especially if you are going out and you're doing these one-on-one conversations with customers, with consumers. And then it introduces a couple other things that are important. I'm going to borrow two concepts here from hard science, from physics, and from particle physics. And then it can introduce what we refer to as an uncertainty principle. And this is related to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, where if you measure one feature with increasing precision, then by default you're going to lose precision on some other feature. And when we're talking about market research, or we're talking about active data collection, what we mean is as you increase the specificity of the standardization or the answers that a consumer can give back, then you might reduce the authenticity of the response they can give. If you narrow the choices that they have to respond to you, then you're narrowing the field of how honest they might be able to be with you. On the flip side, if you give them carte blanche and they can return any answer that they want, then you might have a difficulty standardizing those answers or being able to aggregate them. And then it's also possible that you might introduce other observer effects, where just the fact of measuring produces the answers, whether it's one of these particular biases, like the consumer wants to give a response that they think is good, or what a good person would answer, or perhaps they figure out the kind of survey you're doing, and then they want to pick the answer that's right, that the researcher thinks is going to be the correct answer. Or maybe, like has happened in other studies, just the act of being studied will improve the consumer's behavior, like the Hawthorne effect did. So if that's the kind of declared interest that these surveys are going to give us, then how do we take demonstrated interests, which maybe we're agreeing is more authentic, but can be really high volume, really high velocity? How do we take that and structure that into something that's equally actionable and usable? And one of the key distinctions between declared and demonstrated interests is this quote from Netflix, and this is what Seth apologized for me in advance, is that a lot of the recommendations that Netflix do is not based on what you say you like or how many stars you give to something, but what you actually watch. So, as he says, you might give 5 stars to An Inconvenient Truth because you think it's very important, but then you're going to watch Paul Blart Mall Cop 2 3 times in a few years. Apologize. Anyone seen Paul Blart Mall Cop 2? Right, you're all lying. So you actually have, but you don't want to say that's what you're doing. So what you say you want and what you actually do can be 2 very different things. So again, we believe these demonstrated interests are valuable, so how do we get at them? How do we make them actionable? And it's through high resolution text classification structure, particularly a taxonomy. So we can take this passively collected data, we can scale it, and we can analyze it to produce those ideal kind of qualities we talked about earlier. Something that's deep, that's granular, gets down to really specific interests and affinities, but can also be consistent across consumer responses. So why do this? Well, you're going to get depth, breadth, repeatability because the system's the same every time. Then you're going to be able to reproduce results from consumer to consumer, study to study, and compare them across each other. And you're also going to be able to compare things cross-channel. For us, it really doesn't matter where the data is coming from, whether it's a search query, whether it's browsing behavior and clickstream behavior, or social media, or a survey response. Once it's classified into the structure, then apple-to-apple comparison can be made much more rapidly. Your time to insight is going to be shorter because, again, you're not relying on as much manual effort, either in delivering the study or receiving back the responses and coding them into a structure. Minimizing that researcher, experimenter impact, because ideally the consumers that you're studying passively don't even remember that they're part of a panel necessarily, and hopefully they won't affect or change their behavior. And you're going to make your current data assets work harder. And this is something that we hear all the time from our clients, where if you do a study once, then you probably went out with a very particular goal in mind, and you asked questions or you did research that would satisfy that goal. And then after it's done, it might sit on a shelf, and maybe you look at it at the end of the year or maybe every quarter, but once it's done, it's done. With passive data collection and analysis, then you can go back to those old studies and you can classify them to understand the kind of interests that are latent in there, even if they're different than the specific question you might have been looking for. And then you can make those old assets work harder. You can squeeze more relevance and more action out of them. So let's look at a couple of use cases and how this might work. A couple in a closed network like a panel, and then one in an open network. So as far as a panel, we have a customer who does a mobile device panel in the UK. And they have full activity data on these users' mobile devices. And they can use this to do a lot of quantitative analysis about how they use their device, how quickly their battery runs out, how often they're on Wi-Fi as opposed to cellular data, et cetera. But they wanted to do something more qualitative. They wanted to be able to understand the browsing behavior that they're capturing through the browser and understand the real interests that are driving these consumers when they're consuming content or when they're shopping. So what we were able to do is collect all of the raw URL data that they were returning from these clients and pass it through our API endpoint that is specifically devoted to website classification, which means we can take that URL and we can recreate the experience that the consumer had when they viewed it, which is beyond just the URL string or some of the metadata that might be on the page, but really deep topical information that was on that site. And this can give a more authentic insight into what that person was consuming or the kind of interests that they have. And then for the agency, they can go to their brands and they can do much richer studies, and they don't have to go back to their panel at all. They don't have to try to opt them into a new survey or potentially have churn in the panel because the panelist remembers, oh yeah, I signed up for this, no thanks. They can do this really deep analysis and just on the data that's constantly coming in moment by moment. So they can then leverage this panel not just for the quantitative aspect, but the qualitative studies like path to purchase or helping to plan media, measuring campaign effectiveness as a brand maybe did a large ad buy and then wanted to see how consumers' habits or what they were consuming might have changed. Or do other demographic segmentation, understanding the interests that might be high in 18 to 25-year-olds that were in market for your brand versus 35 to 40-year-olds. And then we could also do this by deploying an on-prem solution as well, in case there's sensitive browsing data that the panel can't have leave the agency's storage. Another closed network use case, again, using a panel here in the US who have access to browsing behavior and search query behavior. And they, for their brands, would help opt in these panel members to then issue another survey to them. and have them return responses. But finding and segmenting these panelists based on what the brand was looking for was a large effort, largely a manual effort, in either doing Boolean basic queries against the search query data and then passing that off to a team of coders who would have to go through and hand code. So they needed to automate this process to scale the classification, return results faster, and be able to iterate faster on behalf of their brands. So they didn't have to wait potentially days to take a measurement and then take an action. They could maybe do that cycle in just a few hours. So again, they were able to pass us the rich search query data, and we were able to process that in seconds for thousands and thousands of queries instead of days with a team of coders. And because it was automated, these queries could then be part of a manual workflow, either to deliver back to human coders something that was cleaner, had less noise, and then the coder could focus on just making more fine-grained, even finer-grained distinctions, or doing some of the things that human coders are really good at. So the outcome is obviously they could lower per-person costs and increase coding accuracy. Some of the things Stu talked about, disagreements among coders, or gaps in their understanding, or just how narrow or wide they might be looking for these interests as signaled by the members of the panel. So you could identify a greater number of panelists in more specific clusters, because that's what a taxonomy is really good at, is identifying the associations and the connections that exist between different topics, and how that might not be always organically revealed in just a basic Boolean search query. And then subsequent surveys that this agency delivered to these consumers could be normalized between their declared data and their demonstrated data. So if I demonstrated behavior constantly and then that conflicted with the answers I gave you on your survey, maybe you wanted to segment me into another group and give me a follow-up survey, or somehow figure out why there was this distinction and this breakage in between what I did and what I said I did. And then going from a closed network to an open network and something like Twitter, which is really 100% demonstrated data, and how we can analyze that. So for an agency working on behalf of a home improvement brand, they needed to devise a modern media plan. And they needed to focus on identifying what the real shared meaning was between their brand values and the consumer's values. So rather than just bombarding them with calls to action and advertising that might be alienating, really developing this relevant conversation to increase customer lifetime value. Again, they were doing a manual coding process and needed to automate that, but also needed something cross-channel so that they could take insights that were derived from social, but apply them to search or content creation and across their media plan. So what we're able to do is to analyze thousands of posts from the brand's social followers and do so very rapidly. And not only the brand's followers, but also competing brands, and trying to identify key individual distinctions in their topics of interests and their affinities, something that would be authentic and defined from the brand's followers compared to their competitor followers. And also because of the taxonomy that we have and able to classify this data really across all topics, and the fact that we're pulling a lot of social media data all the time means that we can build a standard social index. So we can understand the rates and the frequencies that any topic might appear on social media. Because when you're doing this kind of analysis, as we are all people, we don't want the brand to get back just information about the Kardashians, or wishing people happy birthday, or how much you love Paul Blart Mall Cop 2, because everybody might do that. We want to find the things that are authentic about the users and gives them some sort of uniqueness. And that's that horizontal blue line suggestive there. And then we could also connect cross-channel to see what kinds of long-form content might be resonating on social, again, because classification into the same structure allows for that easy one-to-one comparison. So what was the outcome? Well, we're able to identify these really small feature distinctions between the brand's followers and their competitive followers, something that maybe another automated system might have difficulty distinguishing, because this is a niche product in the home improvement space, so naturally their followers, as well as competitive sets, are DIY enthusiasts. But that's not necessarily deep enough to really create the kind of content that's going to distinguish this brand from the other products that are in the aisle next to them. So we were able to understand that this brand's followers, they were really strong into carpentry, woodworking, custom furniture, antique tables, things that might be sort of glossed over by a higher level classification system. Whereas the competitive followers were much more into kind of general home improvement tasks, working on their bathroom, replacing windows, installing shutters, that kind of thing. So it's a key and subtle distinction, but it's really these authentic interests that could be demonstrated when a consumer didn't just have to choose from do you like doing projects at home? Or, when did the last time you went to a department or a hardware store? But really deep, specific questions and answers. And then we could cleanly identify where the brand values could overlap with these consumer values, whether that might be how to target them with the right content, or give them a very personalized offer, or build a marketing messaging that would work for that key consumer. And delivering that map for future content creation and a clearer path to audience connection or building lookalikes is really what mining these demonstrated interests allows us to do. So that's basically sort of a high-level overview, and I hope that you understand how the demonstrated interest can be daunting and can be high volume and high velocity if classified into a consistent structure, can then produce something that can be just as actionable and just as manageable as a more declared survey-based data. Thanks, guys.
Ian, do you want to take some questions? Do we have questions for Ian? Any questions for Ian? Well, I'll ask you one.
Okay.
I'll ask you one. You and I have discussed an ability to classify not only textual content, but to search for intent signals. Mm-hmm. Could you say anything about how intent, search for intent fits in with what you've been discussing?
Yeah, so there's several ways that we help process intent. Intent can be expressed textually, so there'll be certain words that I use that might signal that I'm interested in buying something, or I'm comparing one brand against another, or I'm asking for advice. But intent can also be more latent, and that's where analyzing the progression of someone's habits over time can be really telling. So if I'm analyzing clickstream behavior, for example, then I can understand that if someone who eventually went and checked out at a shopping cart and bought my product, what kind of signals did they create in the browsing that they did up to that? Were they looking at reviews, or were they looking at how-to guides for how to repair a cabinet or something like that? Or were they doing something that might be completely out of the vertical that you would expect? When you have enough data points and you're able to compare them consistently through a structure, then you may have these very surprising details surface. And you might find out that really the best consumer for my home improvement product is someone who is very actively reading about the Penguins Stanley Cup win last night, or who rides Harley Davidson motorcycles, or all these other things that wouldn't necessarily come up when you're asking them questions or thinking to develop a survey, but is latent in the data that they give off, that they demonstrate.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.